This is my 1971 Schwinn Suburban that I bought in college 7 years ago. I paid $110, a price that I thought was about $10 or $20 more than it should have been, and I remember being pretty annoyed about that. It was made in Chicago, USA, and originally sold for $79.95. It's a 45-pound steel framed monster. After college, it got stored away, mostly unused, always taking up space, and I nearly sold it more times than I should care to admit. My road bike and tri bike are great, but they feel like tools, means to the ends of going fast. The Suburban is the opposite of that. It doesn't want to go fast, it can only be ridden sitting up, slowly, and purposefully. The Suburban is a bike for biking's sake, and I love every part of it. What I didn't know was that the story of the bike that I loved so much was so interesting and so unexpected. But that's what this sticker would reveal. More on that later. So here we are 50 years after it was made and 7 years after I purchased it on its 50th birthday, and it's time to bring the Suburban back to what it looked like when it came out of the famous Schwinn Chicago factory. But while I start work on it, I want to tell you about this bike and what I'm going to do with it. Suburbans are common, though this particular example has a lot of desirable features, is in really good shape, and is completely rideable as it sits right now before I do any work on it. It's probably only worth about $150. I'm not here to tell you what to do with your vintage bike, but I bought this bike because I love it for what it is, and I want to highlight that, not change it. I acknowledge that it already looks pretty decent, and spoiler alert, it's not going to look wildly different when we're all done. All I'm going to do is pour a ton of effort into making this bike be the best it can be. This is a more or less original example, and I'm not going to be the one to change that. I started by removing the brakes. As you can see, they're in great shape overall. The rear pads seem like possible Schwinn originals, but the fronts were replaced by me when I was actually riding this, probably to counter the terrible braking performance on these chrome rims in the wet. It's time to loosen the bolt holding the derailleur on, and remove it. Moving to the back of the bike, it's time to disconnect the chain using a chain tool. I suggest wearing rubber gloves to keep the old dirty grease off of your hands. Schwinn was known for using very high quality chrome on its old pieces, and I'm super excited to see this bike slowly shine up as we make progress. The chrome should look stunning against the dark frame, originally called Sierra Brown by the Schwinn marketing folks. Once we've got the rear derailleur and brakes off, it's time to carefully remove the fenders. Seems like I'm missing at least one bolt or nut. Now's a great time to talk about the importance of having the right tools for the job. These bikes lasted decades before getting in your hands, so go to your local hardware store and pick up the right tools for the job so you don't round off the nuts and bolts. On this old American Schwinn with world parts, it's a mix of both SAE and metric. Whenever possible, I like to use the box end of the wrench for a better grip. Next, I want to take the seat off. I'm super lucky that the last person to build this bike, maybe the original mechanic back in the early 70s, built it properly and used grease, so it came out easily. This is an original seat, and as you can see, it's pretty torn up. But more than that, I just can't get comfortable on it for rides lasting longer than about 10 minutes, so we're going to be replacing it. Next, I want to remove the handlebars and stem. Schwinn used a quill stem that works by using a bolt to pull up a wedge that tightens inside the head tube. By loosening the bolt, we release the wedge. We loosen the bolt and then take a piece of scrap wood or something soft and hammer and tap it down to release the pressure from the wedge. Now we just hope that original mechanic used enough grease on this piece to stop it from seizing in place, and thankfully, I'm good. Take a look at the caged bearings that were inside the head tube. They're actually stamped with Schwinn branding. I think when people say they don't make them like they used to, it's things like this. It's such a tiny, meaningless, hidden detail, and yet there it is. Next, I took the pedals off. The easy way to remember is that you always unscrew the pedals toward the back of the bike. These particular pedals were some of the first ones to include reflectors, and they're now called bow reflector pedals in the Schwinn community. This particular Suburban is a 5-speed with 5 cogs in the back and a single chainring up front. I think the crank is one of my favorite parts on this bike. It's just gorgeous. First, I removed the 30mm lock nut using an adjustable locking wrench, making sure not to round it off. Next, I removed the keyed washer. It's time to remove the bearing cone. Once these are all off, we have access to our caged bearing, which needs to be removed and slid off the crank. And then it's just a matter of removing the bearing on the other side and rotating and removing the crank arm. The grease situation in here was actually kind of interesting. One side seemed relatively fresh, but the other side seemed really dry. Mediocre maintenance? Water ingress? I'm not sure. That's what happens on a 50-year-old bike. Now I've got the bike almost down to the bare frame, and it's time to start cleaning. I'm going to be using an ultrasonic cleaner for a lot of these small parts with some diluted, non-toxic degreaser to really get these parts clean. It's so low effort, but more importantly, it's just great for getting rid of dirt even in parts you can't physically reach with a brush. You can see just how effective the ultrasonic cleaner is without even scrubbing, but now just by taking a light bristle brush to these parts, the remaining dirt just comes right off. If you have particularly stubborn parts, you can fill up a plastic baggie with more concentrated degreasing solution, put the part in the bag, seal it up, and then put the bag in the ultrasonic cleaner, and the vibrations will still clean it. So now we're just down to the bare frame. The frame itself was caked with decades of dirt and grease and road grime. Typically, you don't want to use dish soap on paint because it's going to strip the wax and protectants off of the paint, but my goal was actually to get down to that bare paint so I could do some further correction later on. Having the frame fully stripped really helped me clean all the small places and gave me my first best look. Though the paint definitely has some clear scrapes and scratches, it's in super good condition overall, though a bit hazy, with no dents or serious spots of rust. Back inside, I disassembled and cleaned the brakes. After they were cleaned and dried, I used Mother's Mag aluminum polish to really shine them up to almost better than new before reassembly. These parts were all rust-free and shined up beautifully. The disappointing thing is that much of what makes aluminum look dry is oxidation, and even though you're going to polish them and they'll look beautiful right after polishing, they will start to haze over again, but it's still worth it because they stay much better looking than when you started. Next up is the crank. I used paper towels to clean up most of the grease before switching over to hot soapy water. All the bearings went through the ultrasonic cleaner a couple of times, blasting out the old grease. The crank shows spots of rust, but it's not terrible. By using some crumpled up aluminum foil dipped in water, I was able to effectively just erase the rust. The handlebars also had some light rust and received the same treatment. Like I said earlier, Schwinn is known for the quality of the chrome that it used, and it's super easy to bring that quality back to life with just a little bit of work. I collected all of the small bolts and nuts from the bike and put them in a bath of evaporust along with the stem. Evaporust works by chemically removing the rust over a period of about 24 hours. Though most of the parts had very little or zero rust on them, this ensured that they were perfectly rust-free before moving on, both internally and externally. The stem did have a little bit of minor rusting, but sitting in the evaporust cleaned up perfectly. Next, the rear derailleur, which was actually in pretty fantastic condition overall. I generally wouldn't recommend putting a rear derailleur through a degreaser quite like this, but the GT100 was so overbuilt that even the pulleys were metal. A minute in degreaser blasted the old dirt and grit out of the springs, and I gave it with a quick hit of oil to prevent flash rust. And at this point, it was generally just about time to start reassembly. Next was the paint. Years ago, when I was looking forward to restoring this bike, I had this fantasy and big ideas of stripping the paint off down to the bare frame and repainting it. That idea morphed into just touching up all the paint. But then the closer I got to actually starting, the more I valued preserving the bike as it is and simply highlighting the condition that it's in. It's a 50-year-old bike, and it's not my goal to pretend like it's brand new. Though most of the paint was undamaged, it was dry, hazy, and rough even when fully cleaned. I used a rubbing compound and applied it by hand. Though the camera doesn't show it super clearly, the compound instantly brought back a huge amount of gloss and depth to the paint. It now feels smooth versus chalky and rough. But since the paint is now bare, it's important to protect it. I chose a natural carnauba wax, which further brought out the depth of color and added a level of protection to the paint. Some people might be upset that I left such obvious scratches in place, but I'm pretty pleased with the decision to preserve the authenticity while highlighting the best parts of the frame. Next, it was time to work on the wheels. I removed the freewheel from the rear wheel by using a freewheel tool, large wrench, and cheater bar. I took the spoke protector off and soaked it in evaporust for 24 hours. This was one of the roughest pieces of the bike overall, but I'm super happy with how the evaporust worked. Once it was rust-free and degreased, I took Flit's chrome polish and went to work on this. Super happy with the results. Next, as with the crank, I decided to clean up the hubs. I removed the nuts from the axles to get access to the bearing cones. I removed the cones, removed the free ball bearings, and degreased the races. I used the ultrasonic cleaner on all the small parts before packing grease into the hubs and individually replacing all of the ball bearings, making sure to get the right number on each side. Next, I replaced the axles and tightened them up, ensuring that the bearings would run smoothly on the cones before installing the locking washers and the nuts. Again here, I used a lot more Flit's chrome polish on the hubs. An interesting note, they still show Model 71 on them, verifying that these are in fact original wheels to the bike. Next, I wanted to tighten the wheels up a bit. Though both wheels were generally quite true and wobble-free, many of the spokes were loose. I went through and added about a half turn of tension to each of the spokes, working every third spoke and going around the wheel 3 times to apply tension evenly. Now onto the wheels themselves. They're shiny, but even after being washed, they're rusty, dirty, and generally dull. I started by using the aluminum foil technique to remove the small rust spots. It was slow going and kind of tiring on my hands, but effective. Next, more Flitz chrome polish. The best way to do this would probably be to fully disassemble the wheel, but that's a step further than I wanted to go. Though it was a lot of work, the outcome was worth every minute, and again, that original Schwinn chrome looks stunning. Next, it was time to put the crank back onto the bike. I started by properly packing the caged bearings with loads of grease before installing one onto the drive side of the crank. I added more grease to the inside of the bottom bracket, slid the one-piece crank through, and added the other caged bearing on the left side. As with the wheels, the goal isn't to tighten it all the way, but rather to tighten it as much as possible to remove play while still letting the crank spin freely. It is a 50-year-old one-piece crank though, so it's not going to be perfect, but we can do pretty well. Once I was satisfied, I installed the keyed washer and the lock nut. The keyed washer lets you tighten the lock nut all the way down hard without spinning the bearing race, causing them to bind. At this point, it was time to start adding larger pieces back onto the bike, including fenders, handlebars, and brakes. There are so many little details about this bike that I'm super proud of, and I don't have time to put them all into the video, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and ask. One of the things I'm most proud of, though, is how original I kept the bike. I did need to buy a new shift cable, but I was even able to find a new old stock Schwinn original from who knows how long ago. I was also able to reuse all of the original cable housing and end caps, though some of them are getting a little bit worn, so I might be replacing them at some time in the future. But in short, the goal was to keep this as original as possible, and generally speaking, I think I succeeded, and I'm really happy about that. I got this used Schwinn saddle off of eBay. It originally belongs to another bike from the same 70s era as the Suburban. Although it's not quite original, I think it looks good on the bike and it's comfortable. And remember, this is actually a rider for me, so it's not just meant to be a showroom piece. And with that, here it is. From 30 feet away, it might not look that different from where we started, but the closer you get, the more you see, and the more this bike shines. I love seeing this bike and imagining that this is what it looked like when it rolled off of the assembly line 50 years ago in Chicago. The chrome on the handlebars and brake levers and rear derailleur and crank looks absolutely fantastic. This is a bike that was used and ridden, and it has the scars and scratches to show it. But underneath that oxidation was potential, and with just a few weeks worth of work, we were able to undo 50 years of damage. I'm super excited to be able to ride this bike down the street and wonder if 50 years from now somebody is going to be doing exactly the same thing all over again. But this video isn't over yet. The truth is, I've had this bike for 7 years and didn't even know the history of it. When I started working on this bike, I noticed the sticker for Kistler's Bike Shop. Just for fun, I decided to Google them to see if they're still around. Turns out that they operated out of Portland, Oregon, just a few hundred miles away from where I originally bought this bike. So sadly, Kistler's closed in 2010, but in my Googling, I discovered a name connected to Kistler's, which was Franz Powell's. And that's where the story gets really cool. See, Powell's wasn't just some random person who owned a bike shop in bike-obsessed Portland. Powell's was a former Dutch pro who joined the Dutch national team in 1936 before eventually competing in the Vuelta a España, the Tour of Switzerland, and the Tour de France. In 1940, he was leading in the 6th of 7 stages of the Tour de Catalonia when the race was suspended because there was news that Germany invaded Poland. He served in the war before eventually returning to racing and eventually retiring at age 32, competing against the likes of Fausto Coppi and Louis Sunbobe. And then he moved to Portland and took a job as a bike mechanic at Kistler's and ended up buying the shop just a couple years later. He imported European bikes like Peugeot and Raleigh, but then he did something which was super cool, which was devoted his energy to getting more people on bikes and building the community. He eventually convinced the mayor of Portland to build a proper velodrome, which still exists, and in 1967 successfully petitioned the National Bicycle Championships to be held in Portland. There's way more to the story, but the keys are Powell's eventually cemented Kistler's as a premier Schwinn dealership in Portland, and more importantly, he's arguably the key figure in why Portland is one of the most bike-obsessed cities in the US still. He was active and racing until his 70s, and now I have one of his bikes. I want to show you one last photo, which is Franz around 1960 in his shop, which is likely the shop that this bike rolled out of. Even that's super cool to me, but I want to do one other thing, zoom in, and I'll let you decide for yourself what you see there. To me, this bike is truly unique. It didn't define a city's future, but it was witness to that change. And to all of you out there, I hope that this inspires you to think about what you have and what it means to you and if it's worth keeping. I don't want to anthropomorphize this bike because I know it's just a bunch of steel tubes, but when I ride it, I feel like I'm experiencing something that a bunch of designers in the 60s worked consciously to get me to feel, and that's a real, powerful connection to the past. I might be pining for a simpler time that probably never existed, but when I ride this bike, I feel like I understand the feelings of the real person who rode it out of Kistler's 50 years ago, and that is an experience worth saving. So thank you for letting me share this story with you. I want to give a special shout out to That 70s Schwinn Bike Channel. It's a bike channel here on YouTube. He was a great resource to me. He and his videos both really helped me out directly with a few things on this project. If you liked this video, you owe it to yourself to go check out his as well. If you have a vintage bike or a vintage anything that you've worked on restoring, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. I love hearing about these stories. Until then, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.